and to the UK, where British Prime Minister Theresa May is pushing hard to make good on her promise of a speedy exit for the UK from the European Union, with the Parliament today approving the Brexit bill that will enable her to begin official negotiations with EU leaders as early as the end of March. But May's determination to move ahead with Brexit has spurred Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, to revive her efforts for Scottish independence, calling for a new referendum on a political exit from the United Kingdom as early as next year. Let's go now to London and our correspondent there, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, with this Parliament vote, does Theresa May have all the backing she needs to move ahead even this month with Brexit?
Indeed, she does. And you've got to remember that this is quite a big victory for Theresa May so far. She had wanted to trigger Article 50 without any involvement of government, of Parliament, rather. She had decided that she would do it by royal prerogative. But instead, she was challenged in the High Courts, and then she challenged the High Court judgment in the Supreme Court and lost both cases. And it was decided that there needed to be a parliamentary vote. So the Brexit bill was born, and that made it through the House of Commons without any amendments, her first victory. And then the House of Lords added 2 amendments. But when it sent it back to the House of Commons, they were both thrown out, and the House of Lords backed down, which meant that as of last night, it was clear for her to go ahead and trigger Article 50. However, it's not believed she's going to do that until the end of this month, but she has the all clear now to do so.
Jonathan, when she does start those talks with EU leaders, what are the big issues, the big problems that may come up in negotiating the Brexit?
Well, there are all sorts of problems that could be coming up in those negotiations. And one of the biggest problems now for Theresa May is closer to home, with Nicola Sturgeon saying that she believes that because Theresa May is pushing such a hard Brexit, as it's being called, she says that Scotland deserves another referendum to decide whether or not it wishes to be independent from the United Kingdom. Her argument, of course, is that Scottish people in 2014, when they had that choice, many of them voted to stay part of the UK because they were told that had they chosen to leave the United Kingdom, Scotland would have to reapply to be a member of the European Union, something that they wanted to continue. And sure enough, in that Brexit referendum just last year in June, most Scots did vote to remain part of the European Union. So there's now debate at home over whether or not there'll be another Scottish independence referendum for Mrs May to contend with, and whether that would take place, if she does give permission for another one, before or after the end of the Brexit negotiations. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty going on relating to Brexit and the knock-on effect that it could have.
Jonathan, short of the first English invasion of Scotland since the 1700s, is there any way the British, Theresa May, can stop a Scottish Brexit if they vote yes on the referendum?
So sure enough, Theresa May has got the option of not permitting there to be another referendum on Scottish independence. Nicola Sturgeon has said she'll ask the Scottish Parliament to ask the Westminster Parliament for that referendum, but it's certainly within the power of Mrs May and her government to grant it or not. Whether or not she would say no if asked is another matter, because it may not look too good if she does that. However, there are plenty of arguments against, bearing in mind that there was that referendum in just 2014, and that there doesn't seem, according to polls, to be that much of an appetite in Scotland necessarily for a majority to want another referendum straight away. All those old issues that were debated quite apart from Brexit in Europe will come to the fore again, creating much uncertainty for people both sides of the Scottish border, and that's something which could make life difficult for everybody, not least for Mrs May, who has bigger fish to fry in some senses. Now she's trying to work out how Britain will exist in the world outside of the European Union.
And when would that really start? How long would this whole Brexit process go to its completion, when it will be fully independent of the EU?
So Theresa May always said that she wanted to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty in March this year, something that she can now do. It's believed that she'll do it towards the end of the month. And that then sets off a timetable that could last up to 2 years. That's negotiation with the other European nations that could last up to 2 years, at the end of which both sides will hope for some sort of deal in order to decide how the relations will go in the future. But Mrs May has said about that as well, that should there not be a satisfactory deal, she's happy for Britain to leave the European Union without any deal, which would see, of course, British exports hit with tariffs under the World Trade Organization rules, something that she's getting criticism for. However, she says that that's her negotiating position, and she managed to get rid of amendments, as I said, in the House of Commons that were put in by the Lords, which would hamper her, which would somewhat restrain her hand in those negotiations. So now she's free to go ahead. She's free to take that 2-year period and to negotiate more or less as she wishes. But of course, there'll be plenty of parliamentary debate and involvement during that whole period.
Plenty of debate about the Brexit. Do those people who oppose it, such as former Prime Minister Tony Blair, have some kind of option during this period to reverse the Brexit?
Well, those in favour of Britain leaving the EU are criticising the Remainers, or as they now call them, Remoaners, for continually trying to find ways to stall the process. Though most mainstream politicians are in agreement that even if they voted against it, and even if they continue to believe that leaving the EU is bad for the United Kingdom, that is what the people of the United Kingdom voted for in an enormous democratic exercise where they were given a yes or no choice, an in or out choice. So many of them say that it should be respected regardless of their own personal opinions. But respecting it and figuring out just how that exit should happen are two different things. So some believe that while Brexit should go ahead because it was democratically mandated, Mrs May should not be taking such a hardline position in the negotiations and should be looking to soften Britain's exit from Europe so that, for example, the status of British people working in Europe now and Europeans living and working in the United Kingdom will be protected. She's not willing to give any guarantees about that in advance. She says that that will all be part of the negotiation and that that strengthens her hand because what British people get abroad in Europe will reflect what she is willing to give Europeans living and working in the United Kingdom.
And Jonathan, how is this affecting her political standing? Is it this making her more popular, or is she suffering somewhat politically because of the manner in which she's going about the Brexit?
On the contrary, so far, Mrs May's honeymoon period as Prime Minister seems to be lasting quite a long time. She played the game very carefully during the entire campaign period for the referendum. She was officially in favour of remaining in the EU because that's the government position. But she really didn't do much in terms of campaigning in that direction. She said very little. And that meant that when the vote went the other way and all the machinations of the leadership competition for the Conservative Party took place, she emerged almost unscathed by either side, saying that she wouldn't have voted for herself, but as it happened, she was willing to carry out the will of the people. Brexit means Brexit, she said, and she's pushing full steam ahead with that. As far as most polls go, her approval is high, and people still have quite a great deal of respect for Theresa May as Prime Minister. That will, of course, be tested many times over during the next 2 years when there's plenty of scope for her to make mistakes and for there to be problems for Britain as it tries to negotiate those stormy waters of Brexit.
Okay. Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you for joining us from London.